Welcome to the Army Heritage Center Foundation Lecture Series. I'm Mike Perry, and I serve as the host for tonight's program. The U.S. Army Heritage Center Foundation is the Friends Group for the U.S. Army Heritage Education Center. The center is the Army's premier repository for the history and heritage of the U.S. Army and its soldiers. Through donated support, the foundation enhances and promotes both the center's outreach to the Army and to the public. Sponsors for tonight's program is FN America, a world leader in the manufacture of weapons for our military and police communities. Tonight's focus is on Armies in Retreat, and we are joined by two individuals, I should say, who served as the editors and someone else. I'll get with them in a moment. Timothy Heck is the deputy editorial director of the Modern War Institute at West Point. He is an artillery officer in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserves, currently assigned as a joint historian with the Marine Corps History Division. Before becoming to the Military War Institute, he worked as the U.S. Department of State and the International School in Kuala Lumpur. In addition to Armies in Retreat, he is a co-author or co-editor of On Contested Shores, The Evolving Role of Amphibious Operations in the History of Warfare, Marine Corps University Press. Walker D. Mills is a Marine Corps infantry officer in training to fly the MQ-9 Predator. He holds degrees from Brown University, King College in London, and the Naval Postgraduate School. He has written several book chapters on military topics and over 70 published articles in a range of publications. He currently volunteers as a senior editor and podcast host for the Center of International Maritime Security. Joining them is Dr. Katharine, and I'm going to mess it up again, Dahlstrand. Close? Okay. She received her doctorate from the University of Georgia Franklin College of Arts and Sciences. She currently serves as team chief, historian, and editor for the Army University Press Research and Book Team. The Army University Press is the U.S. Army's premier multimedia organization that focuses on advancing the ideas and insights of military professionals and as they learned to lead. So we understand that you have a program for us that you all are you can talk. I'm going to step back and let you do your presentation. I will monitor for questions and provide you the questions at the end. So folks, if you have questions, please use the question icon app on your phone or on your tablet, and I will forward them to the speakers as we move through. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having us tonight. I think, as proper government employees, we have to lead with the traditional, what we say are our personal opinions don't reflect the views of Army University Press, the United States Military Academy, the United States Marine Corps, and any of the other institutions that we're associated with. But we do want to thank the Army Heritage Center Foundation for having us on to talk about our book tonight. So without further ado, I'll launch into kind of our framing and understanding of the book, and then I'm going to hand it over to Walker to do how we bucketed chapters and how we analyzed and prepared it, and then we'll hand it over to Dr. Dahlstrand, who can talk about the creation of the book from formation through publishing. I think certainly with an eye of what Army University Press saw in the project and with the idea of so what? Because ultimately this is a use of taxpayers' dollars and we have to provide a benefit to the warfighter. So without further ado, here we go. Battlefields are dynamic. In large-scale combat operations, opposing forces seek to gain control of terrain, to outmaneuver one another, and to employ combined arms to gain positional advantage. The objective, much more often than not, is to advance. When one side is successful, that means retreat, withdrawal, or evacuation is likely for the other side. Studying those armies who suffer the ignominy of retreat, then, is crucial to understanding war and command. Despite the seemingly obvious fact that someone wins in a war and someone loses, there is decidedly little meaningful and practical analysis on retreating armies. For example, much of the dominant Western historiography of the war between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany was written many years after the events by defeated German generals. As a result, lessons at the operational level from one of the largest military retreats in history are significantly lacking in meaningful analysis or practical advice. Instead, the generals often blamed Hitler for their defeats and retreats, frequently using him as a scapegoat for their decisions and ultimate defeat. Beyond the Germans, existing memoirs and studies for retreating and defeated armies are often rife with political bias and self-serving content. In the United States, the survivors of the largest loser in our history, the Confederate States of America, crafted a lost cause narrative that continues to impact and dominate the national security space today. Recent United States Department of Defense discussions about bases named after Confederate generals, memorials, and even the Confederate flag appearing on military installations all remind us that war does not exist in a vacuum. Legacies of retreat and defeat echo through the generations. In the book Memory and Defeat, Cultural Histories of Military Defeat in the Modern Era, John Horn identified 5 types of defeat. The first is temporary defeat in a battle or campaign that is later reversed by the outcome of the war. The second is definitive defeat that shapes the subsequent peace. The third, total defeat in which the vanquished is stripped of political sovereignty until it is rebuilt in the image of the victor. The fourth is internal defeat in civil wars where defeat is total, total defeat of the rival is sought to rebuild unity in the image of the victor. And the fifth is partial defeat, where a defeat shocks the military and diplomatic stability of the state, but does not threaten its territorial or political integrity. The chapters in our book deal with retreats across all 5 types of defeats. Some are temporary setbacks, others have a marked impact on the subsequent peace, and others are swept aside to make way for something new. Regardless of the retreat's consequences, all can teach something about being on the losing end, even temporarily. Cedric Delves, a British Special Air Service leader in the Falklands Island War, the Guerra de las Malvinas in Spanish, witnessed a defeated army in retreat. In his memoir, Across an Angry Sea, the SAS in the Falklands War, Delves described the retreating Argentinian forces as such. They moved slowly, drifting away from where our battle groups must be. A dark, oozing mass flowed into Stanley, around Stanley, some even making their way out toward the airport. And over it all, silence. The guns had stopped. Nothing. Just the sound of the wind. So this was what a broken army looked like, for we knew what it meant, what we were gazing down upon. Even from that distance, we could see that they were done, a vast mass of spent men slowly departing. In the introduction to Divided Armies, Inequality in Battlefield Performance in Modern War, Jason Lyle remarks that, quote, no consensus exists over what constitutes military effectiveness, a mark of both its importance and its complexity. Lyle divides existing analysis of effectiveness into 2 camps. The first is task-centered. The army that inflicts the most damage to others at the least cost to itself is more effective. The second camp uses cohesion as the measure of effectiveness. He states, cohesive forces are resilient, able to shoulder heavy losses without caving, and exhibit a will to fight that stretches the breaking point of armies, prolonging the war. When studying retreating armies, both analytical frameworks are valid. As such, both approaches found a home in our book, and we sought to identify what it means to be that vast mass of men and women caught inside the conflict. Ultimately, Armies in Retreat is about surviving defeat. It is designed to inform readers and leaders about what to expect when the unexpected happens, to prevent the shock and mitigate some of the terror on every side. While triumphal narratives reign supreme, there is a need for balance and preparation if we are to win the next war. While the United States wants to believe it will remain supreme in combat, the reality is that we face a possibility of defeat and must prepare for it. Retreat, while unpalatable, can ultimately lead to military or national survival, even victory. Though we hope that day will not come, we want to help leaders and forces be better prepared to respond with resilience and cohesion. And that word, retreat, itself is almost taboo in U.S. Army literature. The new field manual FM 3-0 operations only uses the word 5 times, 4 of which are describing the near destruction of the North Korean People's Army in September 1950. Subsequent events revealed, however, that while the North Korean People's Army retreated north in the face of mounting United Nations forces, it was far from defeated. Indeed, just a few months later, United Nations forces would themselves be retreating. Instead of using the word retreat, FM 3-0 uses the term retrograde, and the manual only dedicates 1 paragraph to retrograde operations. Walker and I, being Marines, look to Marine Corps doctrine as well, and there's an apparent aversion to discussing retreat as well. In Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 1, Warfighting, the U.S. Marine Corps' capstone doctrinal document, it uses neither retreat nor retrograde. Instead, it talks about, quote, rapid, flexible, and opportunistic maneuver. Maneuver warfare, the Marine Corps' warfighting doctrine, focuses combat power against enemy cohesion, seeking to create panic and paralysis, an enemy who has lost the will to resist. But what happens when your force is the one close to losing the will to resist? How does a commander keep an army together? The United States military has a long history of retreating, from the early days of the American Revolution through to the evacuation of Afghanistan in 2021. Some retreats bought time or space. Others allowed commanders to regroup or reposition for follow-on operations. Others reflected strategic defeat. Armies in Retreat, Chaos, Cohesion, and Consequences seeks to balance the historical and practical narrative, giving readers a better understanding of how, why, and when armies retreat. The book's 18 chapters examine retreats from the Peloponnesian War to the major wars of the 20th century, and even extend to explore the retreat in the cyber domain. Ultimately, Armies in Retreat is about survival and surviving defeat. It is designed to inform leaders about what to expect when the unexpected happens. While triumphal narratives reign supreme, there is a need for balance and preparation for the next war. The United States wants to believe it will remain supreme in combat, but the reality is that we face the possibility of defeat, and we must prepare for it. Retreat, while unpalatable, can ultimately lead to military or national survival, even victory. Not all armies who retreat are defeated. Some, like the British in the 1950s and 60s, retreat because their nations can no longer afford to keep them in the field. Others retreat to fight another day, like the evacuations of United Nations forces in Korea. And some retreats even become central to national identities, such as China's Long March under Mao. Ignoring the concept of retreat by omission or sophistry and doctrine won't make it go away. Russian forces entering Ukraine a year ago likely did not think a retreat was in their future, but a year of combat operations have revealed otherwise. The first Soviet forces into Afghanistan likely did not think they would watch a retreat across the Haratan Bridge a decade later, nor did most of the American forces who fought in Afghanistan, ourselves included, over the nearly 2 decades, envision the exit from the country that would take place in August of 2021. That was the idea behind Armies in Retreat, and I'm going to turn it over to Walker to talk about some more of the mechanical aspects of how we built the book and identified chapters and the like. So Walker, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. So yeah, I bringing it back to where did we get this idea? It was mentioned in those great intros, but Tim and I both were fortunate enough to write chapters for the Army University Press's large-scale combat operations book set, which is a set of books, and each one is a set of case studies about different aspects of large-scale combat operations. It was kind of inspired by the new Army, I think it's FM3 TAC 0 operations that came out a couple of years ago, and just this kind of pivot away doctrinal interest from counterinsurgency to large-scale combat operations. So we contributed those, and those were some of my first large writing projects. We each contributed one, and then we worked on one together on Soviet operations in Manchuria, and that kind of sparked our interest in both working together. But we also felt like there was something kind of missing from the book set, that these narratives were really, Tim has used the word a lot, triumphalist. It's always about the big success or the big win or the big push. And we were kind of interested in, well, what's on the other side of that? For every operation that's a smashing success, and the ones that we wrote about, the Soviets taking Berlin or Soviet campaigns in early 1945, or the Soviets in Manchuria, were a smashing success. But on the other end, somebody's retreating or withdrawing either successfully to fight another day, or they're kind of disintegrating, and there's a lack of cohesion. And we were, I think, kind of intrigued by that gap and that question of what's the other side, and started looking for it. And then, as Tim mentioned, then it becomes clear that it's really not in most of the doctrine that we're accustomed with. And then you start looking through more academic and historical stuff, and it's also kind of, to use the trope, left out of the literature. And then also, on a personal level, I have a little bit of a contrarian streak, and so I wanted to know, what happens if it doesn't go well? And I felt like that question kind of came part and parcel with this pivot to large-scale combat operations of, what does the U.S. Marine Corps or the U.S. Army look like if you have major combat forces, division, brigade, corps, just really get punched in the face, and how do you recover from that? Because we know from history that that's, really important, right? How do you get back into the fight, or how do you reconstitute, or how do you turn a tactical or an operational reversal into gains later on in a campaign? So we kind of identified that, and first we reached out to Army University Press and Dr. Dahlstrand, and kind of saying, maybe we could just do another book set, in the same vein and the same series, because we liked that format of a volume on specific themes with edited chapters. We kind of decided that really this needed to be its own project. It was kind of separate enough content-wise, and we were excited about that. And we needed to think about, who did we want this to be for? Obviously, Tim and I are both still in the military, active duty and reserves. So we didn't want something that was it was kind of fully academic, and we also don't have PhDs, so we didn't really have probably the credentials to go down that road. So we wanted something that was both useful, but also interesting and engaging, but that could also was credible enough that it was useful in a more academic setting. And we did do double-blind peer review. So then we needed to put out our call for chapters. And Tim had done this before. He did a book on amphibious operations with Marine Corps University Press that you should also check out. But I was worried we weren't going to get anybody who said they wanted to write these chapters, and we were going to have to write these chapters ourselves, which we certainly weren't. I didn't feel like we were capable of doing. But we ended up getting, I think, between 50 and 60 really good submissions, which was far more than we could end up putting in the book. So that was really exciting. But it also brings then these questions of, well, what are you going to cut, and what are you going to not put in? So we kept thinking about, who's our primary audience, and then who do we want, what kind of chapters do we want to include? And so we decided we wanted to balance a diversity of topics, right? We needed to bring in some Civil War that we have, some Second World War, but we didn't want a book that was just, Eastern Front World War II case studies, or just Civil War case studies. And we also wanted kind of a diversity among our authors. So we have some university professors, we have some more practitioners like ourselves, we have some kind of senior graduate students. So we had a kind of a mix of authorship in there. But then with the chapter content, we also needed to balance, okay, so we want kind of a sampling across not just time, but also geography. But if it's too much of a sampling, then we don't have themes to tie it together. So we had to kind of sit down and look at all of the submissions that we had and decide, okay, how can we mold these into, what themes can we pull out, right? How can we, and this is really, the crux, I think, of being an editor, is how do we pick themes that maximize, or frames that kind of maximize what the reader can get out of these chapters. And so we ultimately settled on chaos, cohesion, and consequences. I think Tim actually came up with that when he was running. And obviously we liked the alliteration, but we felt like it was a good fit, because if, in the nuts and bolts of a battle or an operation, in a withdrawal or retreat or retrograde, there is a point where it either works or it doesn't. You're able to hold your forces together, or you're not. And so then we can kind of bucket, okay, the kind of successes and the not successes in chaos and cohesion. But then we also wanted to zoom out and have kind of some chapters that showed what are the consequences, what are the more strategic impacts. If the first two buckets are more tactical and operational, then the third chapter looks a little bit more at the long-term impact. So like Tim mentioned, kind of is there memory or myth making, or what are the more kind of civ mil or political conversations around a retreat, and some of those chapters were really interesting. And so I think between those three buckets, those three chapters or section, I keep saying chapters, those three sections of the book, I felt like we were able to draw out some kind of themes that we thought were interesting. And again, our audience, we were kind of imagining folks in mid-level PME or professional military education. So this is not, it's not a doctrinal manual. It's not a how-to, and it's not purely super academic text. We wanted something that could kind of be a starting point for conversations about retreats and withdrawals, et cetera. And then kind of the last thing I'll talk about is how this project developed over time. So we started it, I think we first started talking about it in 2019. So it kind of gives you an idea of how long this stuff takes to develop, because obviously we both have day jobs. But when we started, it was just kind of an idea. And then I think over the course of the project, some of the world events that we saw, the invasion of Ukraine, and Tim mentioned the withdrawal from Afghanistan, in some ways really validated, I felt like, our decision that our feeling that this was an important thing to write. And perhaps in a future iteration or a future volume, they could have chapters on those events. And it also made it a little bit more personal. Tim and I both know plenty of Marines that were in Afghanistan. It was actually a unit that I had served with that was there in Kabul for the pullout 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. So it kind of really honed in, like, this is an important thing to write. And so we hope that it can be useful to a range of folks in the future, and enjoyable to read at the same time. Tim, back over to you.
Yeah, before I hand it over to you, Dr. Dahlstrand, I think one thing, at the time I was a battalion operations officer, and this isn't a manual for how to run battalion training, but our hope is that, that student at CGSC, that student at the Army War College is going to go back to their unit and go, hey, I read this really interesting thing. And, when we go to the field next month, I want to try it. Because as I was reading these chapters and I had this idea, I was out for my run and coming up with these brilliant oxygen-starved ideas. As the OPSO, I was going, wait, if I wanted to train to retreat, they say a night retrograde of lines or passing of lines, like, that's the most difficult. We never train for it, or we don't train for it very effectively. Like, what would that look like? And the time my unit was at JBLM up in Washington State, and I was like, what would the range control permits for that even look like? Like, that's where my mind went. And we didn't want to write a manual for that battalion operations officer to go into the CO and say, hey, ma'am, hey, sir, we should do this. But we wanted to do something that was going to jog memories. As I said at the beginning, Dr. Dahlstrand was our editor. Wholeheartedly, I didn't say this part, but this is the honest truth. Like, I think the email you sent us back, Dr. Dahlstrand, when we were like, hey, we'd like to talk to you about this idea we have, was something along the lines of caps like yes, 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 yes. Has been an absolutely incredible supporter of us from day one on all of this. And so, Dr. Dahlstrand, I turn it over to you to discuss Army University Press's role and kind of the legacy and intent and impact of the book.
Well, thank you for your kind words. It has been an absolute pleasure to work with Tim and Walker for the past 3.5 years. We have been in regular contact with each other. And it's been just a delight to watch this book come into existence. They first contacted me in early 2020. And I think our very first contact was even before the pandemic hit. And so because I think our first phone call was in my office, but our second phone call was in my living room, and we had to orchestrate some sort of conference calling situation. I think we were all dialing in through Dover Air Force Base for a while. And while my office and organization was trying to figure out what publishing looked like in that world, at the same time, Big Army is having serious conversations about withdrawing forces from Afghanistan, and there just seemed to be a lot of uncertainty. in the air, perhaps. And for Tim and Walker to send this email to me, essentially outlining fairly closely what we ended up with, what the questions they were asking intrigued me as someone who could amplify the voices of soldiers, because that's ultimately what my job is to amplify the voices of soldiers, either past or in history or present, working with them as authors and contributors. What I liked was that, you know, and I'll fully own the triumphalist narrative that Timothy Heck charges us with the Lisco series. I'll own some of that, but I think that this is a really good solution to it too. You know, I'm not in the business, we're not in the business of publishing hagiographies. We're not in the business of letting our employers know the history that makes them feel better about themselves. So it's okay to write some challenging histories. And the way that Tim and Walker approached this was oddly reassuring in a time of so much uncertainty. They're like, well, if this is going to happen, then let's examine it from a million different angles, from a million different perspectives, and see what we can come up with. And just the way that they were honestly engaging with the questions, I knew from the beginning that the end product was going to be worth all the effort. And they were active and eager participants in everything. They were constantly receptive to constructive criticism. They were also not afraid to ask questions. And the thing that I appreciate the most is the good faith that we had in each other in both directions, because our press does not accept books based on proposals. We accept books based on submitted complete manuscripts. So for the 2 years it took for them to get an 18-chapter edited collection, it was all in good faith that we were going to be the press that published them, that they were going to be the ones that came to us instead of someone else. So you don't build that kind of relationship without fostering some good professional habits out of it. And I think that this was my first editing project out of once I got the job. The other editing projects I inherited in process, but from the first phone call and first email forward, this was my first project with them, and I couldn't be more proud of the work that they did. You know, I want to add a little bit to what Walker was talking about the strength and the diversity of perspectives. What I thought was interesting, and if you even go through the end of the book and read about the authors, you know, there's diversity in gender, there's diversity in lots of things, but what struck me the most, especially during the revision process, was that here's an opportunity where people who don't normally write for a military audience are being asked to consider a military audience specifically. And that's where some kind of magic can happen. And I think it happened in our chapters, especially the ones written by straight PhD academics with zero military affiliation, getting them out of a comfort zone and asking them to think about an audience that they perhaps hadn't considered before, and also engage in conversation with colleagues that don't normally meet the sort of academics that they are used to encountering. I think that kind of interaction, that kind of professional development and networking that crosses the civ-mil divide, that's something that makes everyone stronger. And so I think that this is a really strong example of that. And I'll pass it over to you, Tim.
Let me start some questions, if that's okay. One, it does take a little bit, it touches, because my regimental affiliations is 21st Infantry, which was also known as Task Force Smith. So retreat or withdrawal is in our regiment, my regimental's history. And second, I entered the Army in 1974 when we moved into active defense. Active defense was really controlled withdrawal or controlled retreat in order to shape the battlefield, in a sense. And it was largely rejected by most of the younger officers and enlisted because it was looked at as not an offensive capability. So bringing up a topic of retreat is sort of, I think, important. When I first talked to Tim, you told me to read a couple chapters. But what struck me is you don't look at traditional combat units throughout the book. Could you highlight some of those more unique units that you looked at? Walker, pop in here too if you feel comfortable. Especially, I was amazed that you had me focus on a railway unit, which most people would not even think about as far as important for a retreat. If you could talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, that chapter got selected because I like trains. The privilege of being an editor on a volume is you get to pick what you choose. No, I had worked with Eric Seibel on Uncontested Shores before and knew the guy was a fantastic scholar, a great writer, easy to work with. And when we put out the call for chapters, one of the things we did was, we soft launched the call for chapters with folks we'd worked with on other projects. And so Eric was one of them. And I said, hey, I get this idea. And he goes, we've been working on this railroad idea. And I said, give me a call. Let's talk about this. And so Eric and I had a conversation. And as he's explaining the role of railroad links in Korea and how they were used to facilitate the withdrawal of forces and advance of forces and all of this, I had seen something about rail networks and hubs in Europe and the log jam that was going to exist if we needed to get forces into Poland if there was aggression from Russia. And so Eric writes this chapter, it pings off of something else that I had read, and I went, how do we not include a logistics chapter, right? And that allowed us to do more than, and then Private Smith picked up his rifle and walked to the rear, or left his rifle and ran to the rear. We wanted to engage units, audiences, and concepts that weren't necessarily in the every Marine is a rifleman ethos that Walker and I were raised in, and also that engaged in those parts of campaign planning that get overlooked, right? That get fairy dusted sprinkled on them when you're going through Joint Forces Staff College or CGSC or Marine Corps Command and Staff College. Oh, well, the logistics will work. Well, hang on, they might not. And so when a railroad chapter presented itself, we had to say, we didn't have to say, but we chose to say yes and embrace this concept outside of the traditional narrative. Again, and Dr. Dahlstrand, this is not meant as a slam on the LISCO series, because we, obviously, Walker and I wrote 3 chapters for it, but everybody wants to talk about tank formations. Everybody wants to talk about infantry units moving and big blue arrows. And at the end of the day, there's this, maybe apocryphal quote from Patton, like, my men can eat their belts, my tanks need gasoline. So we have to study logistics. And so a chapter like that allowed us to embrace this oft overlooked and especially after 20 years of operations in the Middle East, where, we had the Iron Mountain of supply. We won't have that in the future is kind of the estimate. So how do you deal with it? How do you get around that? How do you plan for that? And that's why a chapter on the railroad seeks out. I think that answers your question. Walker, you want to jump in, or Dr. Dahlstrand?
Yeah, I'll jump in and call out 2 more chapters that were some of my favorites that I would say looked at conventional military units, but through a different frame. So both in the section on consequences, there's a chapter by Dr. Katharine Bates, and she writes about Irish American folk songs about the Battle of Bull Run. And then we got to put that in dialogue with a chapter by Dr. A.J. Cade on the German-American memory of their corps and how they performed at the Battle of Chancellorsville, right? So both kind of actions, battles that, you know, you almost get ad nauseum coming up in the US military, this kind of core Civil War history, but let's put a different lens on and look at how the memory and the myth got made and the kind of political military conversations and evolved after the fact based on basically the slander that there was a retreat or there was a withdrawal or so-and-so or such and such unit didn't put up the fight and how that gets remembered. So I thought that was a really a cool thing to be able to kind of contribute or to have in this book is battles that we know about, that we've read about and seen before, but just looked at through a different lens, if that makes sense.
You also looked at some ad hoc units, two that, again, that you asked me to look at. One was the one of the volunteer units during the Spanish Civil War, and the other one was the Air Force unit in the Philippines thrown together during the Battle of Bataan. Could you talk about why you looked at those type of units? Because in a sense, they are not traditional organizations.
I'll take, Walker, do you want to take the Spanish chapter or you want to take the Philippines? Which one?
I can talk to the Spanish Civil War chapter.
All right, I'll talk to Philippines then. So we picked Frank Blazich's chapter, Dr. Frank Blazich at the Smithsonian, you know, one of the very well-known scholars in the field. He came to us with this idea, and I wanted to work with him on some other projects that we just hadn't had the chance to work together. And he said, look, there's this story of composite retreats. And it's not, you know, we didn't talk about it earlier, but one of the inspirations for this book was an article written by Angry Staff Officer about Bataan and about training units to deal with surrender and captivity. And kind of in that, you know, light bulb goes off moments, I went, well, before that happens, we have retreats. Well, then Frank comes to us and he's like, I got this chapter about this Air Force unit. And we went, okay, we fight joint. We claim to think joint. We claim that our services are interoperable or interchangeable in some ways, but what does that actually look like? And so taking a composite unit, the Pacific Air Corps Regiment, which was maintainers, cooks, clerks, all of the ground support personnel that no longer had aircraft to support because they'd been shot down or destroyed on the runways, or the pilots and the planes had been able to be evacuated. What do you do with them? Well, Frank talks about it and does so very well. And how do you train? How do you lead? How do you mentor, motivate? How do you employ them? And so we thought, certainly coming from the Marines, this kind of inherently multifaceted, multi-domain, to use Army language, type of organization, that, you know, I could go to the flight line at HMLA 167 tomorrow and grab a Marine and go, what's your primary job? And the first thing that Marine is going to say to me is, I'm a rifleman. And the second thing that Marine is going to say to me is, I do da-da-da-da-da with a helicopter. And I'm going to look at him and go, I don't know what the second part is, but I know what a rifleman is. Follow me. Frank's chapter talks about being forced to do that by guys who hadn't even fired rifles since maybe the 5-round FAM fire at their version of boot camp in the 1930s. And so we thought that when we were selecting the chapters, that this was a great opportunity to show composite units, to show units that get repurposed, and to show how in the middle of a retreat or in the middle of a defensive operation, but which was a retreat, how do you train and employ that unit when this is so far out of their comfort zone and anything they actually know? That's how we picked Frank's chapter, and I turn it over to Walker in the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah, so it's a chapter on the 15th Brigade in the Spanish Civil War by Tyler Wenzel. So it's 1938, and this is towards the end of the conflict. And I think that the title of the chapter is Shattered, and they get totally beaten back by the fascist forces under Franco. And so I was drawn to this chapter because, primarily because the Spanish Civil War is something I don't know very much about. And we get, I think sometimes we make a head nod in the military to, it was an important prelude to the Second World War, and you got to foresee some of the tactics and technology that would be so important in the Blitzkrieg, but then we don't actually talk about what happened. So that was the first thing that drew me to it. But it was also an interesting case study in the way that these, the Spanish Civil War is interesting because there's different types of units. It wasn't a very homogenous force, especially the Republican forces. And then Wenzel, our author, he looked at a lot of English language sources and stuff that I wouldn't have necessarily looked at for a book on this or a chapter on the Spanish Civil War. So I think the kind of uniqueness was what appealed to me, and this idea that you get to do a case study that is really an operational case study, a unit level operational case study, like, what we would see elsewhere, but it was set in a conflict that we don't get to talk about as much. So that was really what drew me to that particular one. And like we said, we wanted to have kind of a sampling across time and space. So it's a good opportunity.
Show what a multinational task force would look like when people don't have the same language skills or the same equipment. So it does have, I think, current techniques.
Oh, and by the way, the other part of this was they were foreign fighters. And so we were at the time watching folks process and deal with foreign fighters in Syria, both supporting anti-Assad and pro-Assad regimes and all of this. And we said, well, there's a modern connection as well there.
Let me go through some of the other questions we've gotten here. This is from actually next week's speaker, J.P. Clark. And this would be maybe to Katharine. What sort of pushback did you receive? Because we really, our services don't like really talking about, you mentioned it, don't talk about retreat or defeat. Did you have any challenges as you try to work through the leadership at the press?
Only one challenge, and it's fairly noticeable as the second you open the book. From the very beginning, Tim and Walker and I would have conversations as to who's going to write the foreword, who's gonna introduce this, who's gonna broach the topic of retreat. And you'll see that this book does not have a foreword, that there was no CG who was willing to speak in a way that might endorse a book that examines retreat so extensively. And so, but other than that, I have been sending these books all over the world, and I've been getting requests from ForceCom, and I know that it's being read in the Pentagon. And I just gave a copy to the CAC commander just a couple of weeks ago. And so, and everyone is interested. I've gotten very positive feedback about it. The only thing I could not square away was a foreword by an officer willing to address it.
Right.
Yeah, we had joked with Dr. Dahlstrand about getting the last Soviet officer who left Afghanistan to do it, but he is currently the mayor of Moscow and one of Putin's cronies. And we thought, this is probably, a pun intended, a bridge too far for us to broach.
It's sort of like when I was at Leavenworth in 1988 and wrote an article for Military Review about the lack of doctrine above corps.
Yeah.
Because there was no doctrine above corps back then. And I was told, hey, Major, we don't need to be told.
Right. Well, I mean, and to be honest, what you mentioned earlier when you were talking about the diversity and topics and stuff, one of the things that excited me when I did get when they sent me a table of contents for the first time and I saw the list of topics, I was so excited about the fact that I had only heard of a handful of them, just because there's something, again, in this, at the time that this book was being developed, when there was so much uncertainty, it was nice to know that this was such a common experience, and that there's trends and patterns that we can learn and lessons we can learn from these retreats.
This question again for you, How many entrants did you get? Well, I'd say basically all three of you. How many entrants did you actually have for chapters?
So I only saw it when it was the final draft. So I saw 18 chapters.
Yeah, I think we had between 50 and 60 real submissions because, you know, if anyone's done this before, and obviously this was my first time, but Tim had done it before, so he kind of knew what to expect. You get a range. I mean, you get, I would, you know, say some people who are absolutely phenomenal and almost send you, you know, more than an abstract, and some people that you're really excited to get, and you get some that you are excited about the idea or the topic, and you understand that as an editor, you're going to have to work a little bit more, put in a little more time to kind of develop that. And then you get some that you kind of know off the bat are not quite as serious as others. But we were left with tens. I couldn't give an exact number that were really good that we had to just sit down and say, well, we could put both of these in, which one fits better with our themes. And then you know, as the process goes on, you know, obviously we're not able to compensate these authors, so people fall out. You know, people have, life happens. The pandemic happened kind of right as we were getting started. You know, people have children, move jobs, so there's different reasons that authors kind of aren't able to ultimately come and submit the chapter. So you end up with not exactly what you thought you were going to get, but we were still really happy with what we did. If that, Tim, you have anything you want to?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. We had somewhere between 50 and 60 serious proposals. And when we got that many, we sent an email to Dr. Dahlstrand and said, what would you think about 2 volumes? And she said, how about you write the first one first? Wise and sage counsel, it turns out. But
Good advice.
Yeah. But Walker and I, we had a process and we went through, and we easily could have done a second volume with equally good chapters, we think. But ultimately it came down to, we thought that the chapters we selected fit the themes the best. And I think we're pretty pleased with what happened.
Yeah, and I mean, for another,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, for another example, when we first started, something that, you know, being a Marine and working for CIMSEC, which is the Center for International Maritime Security, I was really interested in having naval or kind of amphibious chapters. And we have a little bit, but we got some submissions that I thought were really, really good. One I remember in particular about the US fleet leaving the Philippines at the start of the Second World War. But when it, you know, came down to the table, you can't keep everything in there. And we really used the themes as a way to help us decide what we could put in and what we couldn't. So that's an example of something that unfortunately, you know, we had to leave out. But it was also exciting to see that then those authors could go on and publish that work in other places.
Well, and I would just like Tim and Walker to know that now that the first volume is published, more than welcome to entertain a second manuscript. So
success breeds more work. This is going to combine, in a sense, 2 questions. You seem to focus heavily on Western militaries. Did you really look, did any of the other chapters come in, look, say, perhaps at North Korea, China? Well, you mentioned the Great March, Russian withdrawals during World War II, or even World War I, or other non-US military organizations?
Right. So to answer the last part of that question first, if you look at the breakdown of the 18 chapters, and we'll take, you know, JD Work's chapter on cyber operations out of it because it's kind of country anonymous. Only 6 address US or proto-US forces. So the other 12 chapters are outside of the United States. And that was intentional, right? We didn't want to do, as Walker said earlier, we could have written an entire volume on the Civil War. We didn't want to do that. We could have written an entire volume on the Russians, or the Soviets rather, in the Second World War, or the Russians in the First World War. We didn't want to do that either. We recognize Because one of the, you asked the feedback question earlier, one of the things that got flagged to us on Twitter was, where's the chapter on Dunkirk? Well, nobody came in with a chapter on Dunkirk proposal that we thought was going to fit the bill we wanted. Some of the headaches with, not headache, but one of the limitations rather of doing an edited volume and a call for chapters that's open is you get gaps. I would love to have had a Latin American chapter or two in there, an African chapter, more chapters in Asia from an Asian perspective, the Indian subcontinent. All of those things would have been fantastic. And if we do wind up doing a second volume, we would focus on things like that. And Walker and I right now, along with Brett Friedman, have an amphibious volume at Marine Corps University Press. And we went out and specifically targeted to fill in some of those gaps that we had in our first books, to fill those things. But this is something I see at the Modern War Institute every day when we get submissions. I can't publish what I don't receive. So if nobody is submitting me things on Africa, Asia, I can't will it out of the air. Now, I can go out and solicit, I can ask for these things, and we try. But ultimately, we were, I don't know if limited is the right word. It sounds pejorative and it's not meant to be, but we could only pick from what we received. And we recognized as we were writing this, the gap, or as we were selecting and as we were looking at things, some of the gaps that were there. But this is where, again, the support of Army University Press was evident. Dr. Dahlstrand mentioned the diversity of the authors earlier. We went to her and said, hey, one of the issues I had with the amphibious volume I did for Marine Corps University Press was I had 2 female authors out of about 20 chapters. I said, that's an imbalance in perspective. That's an imbalance in the name, right? The authors shouldn't all look like me, shouldn't all have gone to Joint Forces Staff College like me. And Dr. Dahlstrand turned as part of the networks that she's part of and shook the trees. And that's when we got Dr. Katharine Basin. That's when we got Dr. Amy Fox. And I mean, Dr. Dahlstrand got the text message like, Amy Fox, Amy Fox. I mean, we totally fanboyed getting Dr. Fox. But at the end of the day, as editors, we could only work with the material we were presented. And so if we do a second volume, hint, hint, cough, cough to the listeners and the viewers, but please do give us those things.
I haven't read the whole book. I've scanned most of it and read a couple chapters. Did you look at anything where with retreat or withdrawal was used as part of a deception plan? Any specific chapter? I guess then no. Okay.
Not that actively jumps out, right? And there's been a lot of talk about deception, the Soviet Maskarovka concept recently, and nothing jumps out. But we did, well, I mean, there was an entire Lisco volume on deception, and then I included it. I think both Walker and I put it in all of our chapters for Lisco because we were writing about the Soviets. But yeah, it's a gap in the knowledge, in the work.
Question more of a modern bent. With 24-hour news coverage like it is today, would the United States have the potential to do a controlled withdrawal or retreat in light of the squabbling that may occur in the domestic front? That's more of an opinion question. You don't have that yet in the book. Is that the next book?
I'll take a swing. I'll take a swing because we watched it happen. We watched as controlled a withdrawal from Afghanistan as could have feasibly happen. At MWI, I've interviewed General Chris Donahue, released a podcast on him called The Spear, talking about that. Matt Hardman, who was one of the brigade commanders at HKIA. As a joint historian, I've done History Division for the Marine Corps has done probably 150, 160 HKIA interviews. The Air Force has already published on the HKIA withdrawal. That was all done under news analysis, whether those reporters were on the ground or whether those reporters were back in DC. It has been done. It can be done again. I firmly believe the U.S. military is capable of doing that. And that, frankly, the media is not our enemy. And I don't think the question was necessarily implying it, but I want to say that the media is not our enemy. Like, how that gets spun, or the reporting gets spun and turned into a political football in some way, that's civ-mil relations work. And that's, there's plenty of scholars at the Army War College and at West Point that write about that stuff. But I think at the operational level, at that brigade corps level, it can be done.
Yeah, I would kind of piggyback off that and say, as Tim did, we saw it just a couple of years ago. And since then, it wasn't a full non-combatant evacuation, but United States personnel left the Sudan, and there was some overwatch and some participation by United States and other partner nations. So I think it's not a question of, if we could do this, this is something that's going to happen at different levels, at different sizes. And so what's it going to look like when it happens again? How well are we going to be prepared? And I think that some of these chapters, I'll talk about again, the chapter by Dr. Cade about the German Corps at Chancellorsville. He's writing about, he has the letters that they were sending back and forth, and the way he talks about the way that they were portrayed in the media at the time. So this is, the Civil War, and they then had to deal with, what is the media coverage of the German Corps at Chancellorsville. And so I think we can, yes, the media environment is different now, but one of the takeaways that I had is, you still have to think about how your actions on the battlefield are going to be portrayed in the media or in the, the civil or political sphere, even all the way back then. And there are historical lessons that we can draw on to better inform and kind of shape those decisions.
Well, Howard's cowards are still highlighted by many staff ride facilitators at Gettysburg. So even 150 years plus, their story sometimes doesn't get the right spin that the soldiers experienced. This question comes from Jim. He said, during every NTC rotation, Blue Force brigades regularly practiced the conduct of rearward passages of lines during training during that time. We expected to retreat following an attack by Soviet forces in Europe and then expected a counterattack. Why do you think the modern Army and Marine Corps were reluctant to discuss this topic? Again, that's sort of another question. Why did we do it in the 80s and early 90s at some of the training centers, but we don't seem to want to talk about it today?
I can take a quick stab at that. I think part of it is, and yeah, I mean, I've gone through Marine Corps MCRE combat readiness exercises before you deploy, and there is, you do practice a passage of lines. But I think we were thinking more about when it's not a choice, right? I mean, when I think of a passage of lines exercises that I've done, they're planned days in advance, and it's basically like you're rotating out. One battalion comes off the line and someone else goes in to press the attack forward or kind of provide fresh troops. But it's not something that's forced upon you. And I think it just kind of goes back to what we've been talking about through the program, that there's this kind of, I mean, in the Marine Corps, we talk about, maneuver warfare all the time, and it's almost like a cult of the offensive. And if you say, attrition, it's a slur, it's a dirty word. And I hope that Marines like us and the leadership is looking at what's going on in the Ukraine, and you're thinking it's not all bold tank maneuver in the Iraqi desert, right, or on the plains of Eastern Europe. There's a lot of other stuff that we have to be prepared for. Though the point is well taken. I think that in the past, this is something that the military took more seriously when they were confronted by the threat of a much larger Warsaw Pact armies just on the other side of the Fulda Gap. And so maybe we're kind of returning to that, thinking of more of a peer or near peer, or as in the Army's terminology, large scale combat operations.
From a publishing perspective, I think you can also recognize a historical pattern of the United States military in the years after military actions that have perhaps not been the most successful, and as a sort of redirection of focus, training for the wars they'd like to fight. instead of the wars that have been
Well,
fought.
I'm going to let everybody have their own, their closing comments, but that would have been a great feed into next lecture program. If you'd like any, Tim, Walker, Catherine, do you want to have any closing comments, or are you good?
Well, I'd like to say one of the things that we've been able to do with Army University Press at MWI is there'll be a podcast series called MWI Presents Armies in Retreat. Walker and I, you get to listen to us again for the first episode, which you can skip now that you've heard this. But I sit down with 6 authors from the chapter authors, and we go through their chapter. And one of the cool parts about that was, while the chapters are incredible, we had to limit the space. And most of the audience will know when you go writing, there is so much good stuff that gets left on that second document on your hard drive, right? That you don't get to publish because you're in space crunch. And those anecdotes come out in that story. So the goal is to have that out in about the next month. When it does, I'll send the link to the Heritage Center Foundation. It'll be on our website at MWI. You'll be able to download it through all of your podcast apps. And
It'll be available on Army University Press's webpage as well.
Yeah, I mean, you'll be able to find this. And it'll allow you to hear the voice of Frank Blazich, John Bratton, who wrote about the American Revolution, Dr. A.J. Cade, Amy Fox, rather. Every time I talk about her, I have to do this. It's talking with the experts, and JD Work as well. That cyber chapter that, as we talked about before we started, is heavy. And it is something that a lot of us don't understand, right? Like I know how to change my password, but the follow-on knock-on effects of that. And so that series will be coming out shortly. The book is available for free. You don't have to pay. I know that, there's probably somebody pirating copies of this on Amazon and eBay already, but downloadable PDF from Army University Press. There's a hard copy.
Order on Amazon.
There you go. Well,
then you told me it was for free online.
Yeah.
So I read it all
Because if
online.
your tax dollars paid for this, your tax dollars paid for this.
Yeah.
Buy our books on Amazon. Don't ever buy our books on Amazon.
I know. Well, I did.
So it's out there. We'd love to hear from you with feedback and encouragement. And Walker and I are easy to find on social media. Dr. Dahlstrand's easy to find on social media. Thanks for having us today.
Okay. And where is the book available, Catherine?
It is available at armyupress.com. And right there on the landing page, you will find a link to Armies in Retreat. As we do our social marketing, but we also make sure that it's widely available freely for download, and we will mail you a copy if you send us a request for one. But don't buy it on Amazon because the authors do not get any sort of recompense for it.
Quick question. What else does Army University Press have on its webpage?
Army University Press is the umbrella organization for multiple outlets for historical and current event outreach. We are the home of the CSI Combat Studies Institute staff ride team. They develop virtual staff rides and develop books for staff ride handbooks. We also publish military review. We also publish military review in Portuguese and in Spanish. We publish the NCO Journal, the Journal of Military Learning, and my department has a goal of publishing between 5 to 6 books a year. So all of which you can find by following us on social media or going to our website.
Okay. Walker, anything? Do you have any closing comments?
They pretty much covered it. Thank you again to the Army Heritage Center Foundation for having us. And as Tim said, the book is free. So even if you only want to read a couple pages or it only sounded mildly interesting, you should still give it a download and check it out.
For those who want to get confused before they hear the podcast, do read the chapter on cyber retreat. I have to go. Tim said he read it 70 times and still doesn't understand it. So, but is that one of your podcasts?
It is. JD Works Chap will be the last of the series because we think it's so important. And really, jokingly, I've said to Walker, if we had to retitle the book again, it would be Chaos, Cohesion, Consequences, and Cyber. It would have gotten its own section. Because it doesn't quite fit neatly in any of the other buckets, but.
Well, thank you for doing it. For those who attended, I would ask you to consider attending next week's talk on the next Wednesday at 7 p.m. J.P. Clark will discuss his latest work, Preparing for War, the Emergence of the Modern U.S. Army, 1815 to 1917. And this, to your point, Catherine, has focused in part looking at how the Army adapted and changed based upon the personal experiences of its leaders and sometimes their biases. So I look forward to seeing folks next week. And again, thank you very much and good luck with Volume 2.